Greetings, class. This is the segment that we will cover the question: how can people be strategic about conflict? And so I'm going to try and summarize a number of different areas, uh, not with super complex depth, but sufficient, I think, to showcase that thinking about how to be strategic in conflict can cover a number of different avenues. I'll start here by talking about we can map conflict. The idea of conflict mapping is that there's kind of a human social interactive terrain, much like we have like a geographic topography. We could think about how close, our proximities to others are in our personal lives, in our work lives, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, or whatever. But we can literally situate ourselves in locations, make those lines, those connections to see how close or distant we are from others. Um, right in your neighborhood, your closest neighbors physically may not be your closest neighbors personally, right? And um, identifying the relationships, right? Like how close do you feel with someone is part of the way you can map it. But the more detail we can get into, right, the knowns and the unknowns and so forth, right, we could think about the different metaphors, right? So which individuals on our map or which relationships would we have bridges showing that there's uh, equitable or even transfer from one person to another, or in which relationships will we put maybe like a gap or an obstacle that showcases that there's the tension. Like, again, it doesn't need to be a metaphor, but we can identify in advance what the terrain is, and we might be able to look into more depth again at not just our relationships with others, but what the relationships between others are. If you have a close friend or close friends who get along well with someone that you have trouble with, uh, you might be able to use those relationships as like the go between you and somebody that you don't get along with. Uh, like you could talk to them. This is going on. Do you think you can talk with so and so about it? Right? Again, that's one strategic way of going about things, is to identify which relationships are most likely to create the outcomes that you want. Um, Plan, right? So the mapping there, I segued into employing it, right? But by the planning phase, but we can plan for conflict, right? There's lots of things that we know. Right? We know what our hot buttons are. We know what the hot buttons of others are. We know what underlying interests are for ourselves, hopefully. And we might be able to guess what those interests and needs are for others. But the more we can identify the features of our conflicts, the dynamic processes that are likely to engage or illuminate um, opportunities for satisfaction, mutual satisfaction. Um, if we know what somebody's got as a kind of a sticking point, right? If we know which things that they've prioritized, which things that they could be more flexible on, or ourselves, right? If we know that there are certain things that we can compromise on and certain things that we can't, again, we can make plans around those known features. Sometimes what your plan is to say to the other party, this is something I'm firm on. This is something I'm willing to work with you on. And part of what that plan then is to say, I plan to model the behavior that I hope others will display in return, right? If you say, I'm not willing to budge on this, but I'm willing to work on something else, And then the other person says, well, I have something that I'm not willing to budge on, but I do have something to work on. That means that there are now two things that can become opportunities for exploration: what you've offered to budge on and what the other person's offered to budge on. Again, there's no guarantee that approaching somebody that way is going to produce the desired outcome, but it opens the door for possibility, and you can plan for that. You can plan for what you're willing to do, and you can also try to plan for what you think the other person might be. If you can anticipate which things that the other person might be willing to compromise on, and they don't bring them up, you can still ask, hey, I said I was willing to compromise on this. Do you think you'd be willing to compromise on that? Again, you can approach it. There's no guarantee that the other person will feel like accommodating your suggestion, but they very much might be appreciative of, yeah, I think that makes sense. We should go along with those two things. And you build on the things that work towards solving your dispute. You can practice. Many classes benefit from the experience of being able to role play. You can take the opportunity to go through a conflict or mediation and negotiation from various roles and see what it feels like when you're in that position. But yeah, we can practice our conflicts in advance, and we can practice our conflicts with others. Sometimes we might have people who are really good at playing certain parts for us, or being a sounding board for us to bounce ideas off of. But you can practice, right? Conflict is something that we experience, but conflict skills can be developed, worked on, improved. We could find out where our deficiencies are when we interact with others. Sometimes we could figure it out on our own, like, hey, I'm not really good at reframing. I say things and it's too blunt. Did it feel that way with you when we did the role play? And the person can say, yeah, it did, or no, it seemed fine. When you said such and such, it definitely made me feel differently about it than if you would have said it the other way. But we can learn from experience. We can learn from practice. And I encourage people, if nothing else, to find your opportunities for, like improving your skills. And we can also practice on small conflicts by just engaging people with some of the ordinary tensions and struggles that we encounter, so that when the big events develop, we're not as afraid, right? Because we're just doing the same types of things we've already been doing. It might be a more intense situation, but at some part of its basic dynamics, it's still the same. A conflict is a conflict is a conflict. It is the threat or perceived threat to a person's interests, values, or needs. And so if you're able to engage with somebody over like an argument on a parking spot or something, then you might be able to apply those same skills to, something that's more significant, should something more significant arise. We can assess, right? And some of the mapping relates to our ability to assess. Some of our planning also might be involved in some of this. But, assessments are really just kind of where we do an inventory of, like what's at stake, what's to be gained. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing what I plan to do? Why do I expect that to work? In some settings, I would say this is the operation of being an agent of reality. We can do this for others, but we can also do this for ourselves. Sometimes we have ideas that the things that we do are going to produce outcomes where a deeper kind of assessment would suggest maybe it actually won't play out the way I want it to, Unfortunately, sometimes we have the highest hopes and expectations, and then we actually just set ourselves up for failure in ways that are predictable in hindsight. And sometimes we can do that more upfront. So we can be strategic about conflict by thinking about things in advance. Is this realistic? Is this likely to work? Why do I think it's likely to work? What evidence do I have, or reason to believe that actually the way it'll play out? One of the things that I'll say is a basic strategy that can be employed with just about any conflict is that before we get into a conflict, if it's avoidable or not, we can identify opportunities in a number of different ways, right? But like, if you know you're going to have an argument with somebody, you can be strategic. And where would you like to start? And that sometimes sets the tone for everything. I tend to try to find in mediation points where parties seem like they're close, or that there might already be existing agreement, or relatively close to agreement on certain issues, so that they get the experience of reaching agreements in advance. And the more things parties agree to in advance, the more that they've succeeded in dealing with their problems, the more buy-in you get. And when you have the buy-in, then that helps to generate a lot of momentum for the harder parts of a process. But again, opportunities. What are the things that you're likely to be able to reach agreement on? Can you go to those things first? They might not be the most pressing part, but once you get more of those things out of the way, like let's say it's a contract dispute between the union and the management, and maybe there's 35 different issues in the contract that they need to reach agreement on. Starting with the most compelling aspects of the dispute is likely to get people more locked in, right? They will not give on their positions at all. Conversely, if you start with the things that are less likely to create that kind of digging in, the more movement you'll get from the sides, right? If it turns out that there's only 5 out of the 35 issues that are super, super complex and super challenging in order to negotiate an agreement, getting agreement on the other 30 things first will help you with those last 5, as opposed to if you don't get anywhere on the big 5, then you're stuck, but you're also less likely to get people to budge on the other 30 after they get more heated and more locked into their sides and the distance and the disagreement. And so then the last kind of 2 points here are that when we do our assessments, when we look at our plans, when we look at our maps, we can be strategic in looking for pursuing the conflicts and the advocacy for ourselves that have a high return on investment, that we think are likely. The people who are easier for us to work with might be a more natural conflict process. Like, deal with those conflicts because it's more likely to generate the kind of results we're looking for. If you go to a business where let's just make up like a mechanic, get your car work done, and you seem to have an issue dealing with one mechanic, but there's another one that you talk with. If you can plan to go into that business on the day that the person you work well with, right? That's strategic thinking. I'm going to engage with the person who I can work with, as opposed to engaging with the person I can't. Conversely, if time is of the essence and it doesn't really matter who's working today because this can't wait till tomorrow, then that's the strategic thing, is to go to the place where you need to when you need to. But even still, the idea is that there are parts that we have control over, and part of what we have control over is when and how we choose to engage in a conflict. We should choose conflicts that will likely produce a better return on our investment, and avoid the conflicts that will have, a lower return on our investment, uh, when and where possible. But again, when we think through the relationships, whatever it might be that's at stake, the biggest part of being strategic is when you make a plan, if you can, step back, think about, are there alternatives that are likely to deal with the situation that I'm trying to take care of in a way that will work better? Exploring alternatives. And maybe you have multiple alternatives. But by thinking your way through the different ways that you can proceed to deal with a dispute, you can choose the one you think is most likely to deliver the outcome that you desire, and to be able to produce that outcome with the least kind of cost to you. And that is strategic thinking, and it's something that we can all do in conflicts, at least most of the time. Some conflicts are unavoidable. Sometimes there are not alternatives, but for the most part, I think that you'll find that there is always a different way we could say it. There's always a different person we could say it to. There's always a different way we could do it. Sometimes it's not a matter of what we're saying, but our ability to listen. Sometimes when we listen, we need to do a better job of listening for understanding. Other times when we're listening, what we really need to do is figure out how to enforce ground rules. But again, we can plan in advance to a much higher level than I think we frequently give it credit for. And that is thinking strategically about conflict. Thank you.